So, how did I come to do a series called The Power of Art? Well, at the end of doing History of Britain, I was very flattered by the fact that all sorts of people in television thought I should do the history of, you name it. Rome was one idea, very big, very frightening. Lots of Holland, history of the Isle of Wight, whatever it was going to be. No offence to Isle of Wighters. I thought, well, you have one life to live, really, and I love doing history, but art has been a long passion of mine. I've been writing about art for many years, teaching about it. But one thing that always struck me when I was writing my book about Rembrandt was how very seldom the greatest masterpieces were done in order to be put in museums. We couldn't live our life with great paintings and sculptures without museums. I can't be grateful enough for them. But there's something about the museum, something reverent and hushed, which doesn't always capture the kind of fury in which and scary situation of high pressure in which some of the very greatest masterpieces were made. I always think of Benvenuto Cellini, a terrible liar, admittedly, but the great sculptor of Renaissance Italy, of Renaissance Florence and Rome, who tells us in his autobiography about trying to make the sculpture, which was his claim to immortality, the Perseus and Medusa, which he always knew was going to be put in the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence, facing Michelangelo's David. So Cellini, much less well known to you as well as to everybody, was going to say with this piece of work, I'm every bit as good as he is. And he'd been for most of his life a goldsmith and therefore sneered at by tip-top highbrow artists. So it was very important for him to get this right. However, he falls sick of something just at the moment that the bronze is going to be cast, and he thinks he's going to die. And he thinks, well, it's not going to be good, but at least posthumously I'm going to be the equal of Michelangelo. Cellini was as well as being a great sculptor, he was a killer. He killed people. He did say, I prefer to kill people with my art rather than my sword, but he did a bit of both. And he was actually under house arrest for unspeakable crimes when he wrote his book. So here's Cellini in bed, and he's dying, and he goes to sleep, and he's woken out of what he thinks of his death fever by his students. And they say, Master, something's going horribly pear-shaped. Literally, it was going exactly pear-shaped with the sculpture. They're pouring the metal alloy into the mould. And it was cooling too quickly. So it would have been this little kind of mini-me sort of blob rather than a statue. So dying or not, he's forced to get out of bed, he tells us, and he throws all the pots and pans, 87 pots and pans in the kitchen, onto the furnace to create more liquid metal, which gets poured into the mould. Masterpiece happens. Genius survives to reap the rewards of fame and go off and do terrible things to people all over again. So I thought, well, yeah, that's the way. So many works of art were created. Not always. There are lots and lots of works of art that are created under serene conditions. Lots of artists, Cézanne, you can think of, who live out their lives in utter tranquility. But there are plenty of artists, not just the most famous cases, Vincent van Gogh, obviously, who live in melancholy torment, but many artists, Rembrandt, who I know well, the good case, whose masterpieces are produced in what I would call the drama of the creative moment. And I thought, wow, God, it'd be fantastic if an art series or an art program could actually gets you out of the art gallery, out of that hush, out of the world of the acoustic guide that tells you how long to stand in front of a painting, when to move on, and plonk you back down into Rome in the 17th century, or Amsterdam, or the Spanish Civil War, if you're going to be thinking about Picasso and Guernica, and make you feel, the sort of hairs stand on the back of your neck as this sort of moment of panic or crisis or drama, the creative moment, takes place. And all that thought was actually in response to talking to a BBC executive who was saying, well, I know, you feel like doing some art programmes, but... and I said, well, yeah, but, I think they should be done like that. The actual way in which a painting could be created could be as exciting for the viewer as the story of a murder or a love affair or a revolution or a war or something like that. It could be that edge of the seat exciting. But I hadn't thought that I'd be doing it. I said, you should have some person X do it like that. And it means a lot of hard work. It means having a certain amount of drama, maybe using actors, not embarrassing reconstructions. What my colleague Claire Bevan, the series producer with whom I've worked a lot, calls men with stick-on beards. I said, I don't want men with stick-on beards. If we're going to do a bit of drama, it better be, it's got to have wonderful production values. Not to be flashy, not to pretend you're Hollywood. You're not in the business of making Hollywood movies, but if it's going to be done, especially if I'm going to do it, the viewer has to suspend disbelief. That's what we do in writing history. Have our readers suspend disbelief for the time they're spending with these books. They have to feel they're somewhere else. They're not stuck on the tube, on the district line, but they're in Rome or Amsterdam or Madrid, wherever it is. And we have to do that in TV. You must never see the stick-on beards. So the executives took all that on board, and it was rather like the History of Britain, where I kept on advising all people who I thought would make a really good series, not meaning me, because TV swallows your life, which it does, dear viewers, it does, in the nicest possible way. And then, of course, put your mouth where your money is, the other way around, I can never remember which. The execs said, we understand what you're saying, and we would love such a kind of art series to be possible, but it can't be possible because it's inside your head unless you do it. So you think, either you're just a big mouth or you have a crack at it. So we had a crack at it, and The Power of Art is the result. Part two in this process, though, was a sort of moment of sheer terror, everyone. When you've done your treatments and you've sort of made your pitch for American co-production, so you kind of know what you're doing in theory, and you've even maybe written a little bit of script, and there comes a moment where what you may have on your hand, you look at each other, Claire and I looked at each other, and you think, right, we have this amount of money, we have this amount of ambitious ideas, but what we may have is what we call an office hit. In other words, an office hit is something that sounds fantastic when you're planning it. Then you think, okay, now we actually have to make it come true on camera. And all sorts of things then come into play. For example, we have a program we're very proud of that you may or may not have seen by the time you look at this, these remarks, and that's our Bernini program about sculpture, directed by Claire Bevan, who I've been talking about. And Claire and I both said, this is a good example of when you have 17th century sculpture, because it's actually sitting in a grandiose marble room in the Palazzo Borghese, for example, in Rome, or in the church, because it's surrounded by wall and museum lights, we actually don't see the sculpture as it came to Bernini in the flooded light of his imagination. You see it as he planted it in a pope's princely room or something, but if you're seeing the figure of Daphne being pursued by Apollo with her fingertips turning to leaves and wood, you need to see it in the reverie of the sculptor's forming imagination. To do that, you need to backlight it, light it against black. You need to spend a lot of money on getting that lighting right, getting tracks, using little jibs. The star work of art is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which is in the church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, and in a very difficult space, a rather narrow space. So we knew we'd need a little kind of jib so that the camera could move in and out of the sculpture, feel Bernini making the sculpture, modelling the smile of the angel, the expression on Teresa's own mouth. So we had certain sort of technical, problems to do, but we sort of knew how we would make it come true. But it was only when we really started filming, now, goodness, in October 2004, a long time ago, because I have other lives. I teach at Columbia University as well, that we felt it coming true. An important part about the series, I should say, is in order to make each program a drama of creation, was to concentrate on one work of art. In Rembrandt's case, the first lines of the program, of those of you who have seen it, said, what's the worst thing that can happen to an artist? Derision, neglect, disgrace. No, the worst thing that can happen to an artist is to have to cut up your masterpiece. And we see a figure with a pair of shears doing that. And this is a painting that was rejected. It was his comeback painting, and it was rejected. And so we knew that for this sort of sense of art as a drama to work, we would concentrate on one, not just one moment of crisis, one moment of trouble in the artist's career, but also one particular work of art. And then we'd loop back from that work of art to explain how the artist got to that moment of trouble, a trouble which the artist might transcend, or in Vincent van Gogh's case, apparently not. And that freed us completely from having to do a program which covered every single greatest hit, every single ism. And there was certain, so that gave me a lot of kind of freedom in shaping the script, which I was sort of very happy to run with. There were certain moments during filming when this sort of generic title, The Power of Art, seemed to be not just a title, but actually seemed to vindicate itself. And here was one extraordinary moment for me, accidental moment in the filming of the program about Caravaggio, the early 17th century Italian artist, painter. And we're standing in the cathedral of the Knights of St. John in Valletta, in Malta. And Caravaggio is an artist who is such a kind of movie maker, by which I mean, it's, you've been to those movies and they seem they're so good, not all of them, they seem three-dimensional to you, even though you're not wearing 3D glasses, that the acting performances and the sheer intensity of the drama seems to come straight out of the celluloid and march up to you in your ninth row seats and pull you towards the action. Caravaggio was like that. He was intensely conscious of having figures appear in light, surrounded by darkness, so that they're almost like an apparition. So you have this extraordinary sense when you're with the greatest Caravaggios that you share the space of the people who are standing in front of you. It's sort of very uncanny, spooky kind of feeling altogether. So that makes the job of a TV presenter incredibly hard. I don't know, I would love to have Andrew Graham Dixon or Bob Hughes or a lot of my friends who do art in talking. And we all somehow feel prats at some point when we're going like that, and this great masterpiece is behind me. I remember doing that. I'll come back to Caravaggio in a second, I promise everyone, but I remember feeling a prat in front of Rembrandt, and his big self-portrait was sort of behind me. And as I was talking to camera, occasionally looking back at him, he had this terrible sense he was looking at me and saying, through those fishy eyes of his, well, I've seen people like you before, Sonny Jim. You come and go, I stick around, actually. So you always feel this slight sense, in my sense, crushing sense of inadequacy, which was, as we academics say, a fortiori, even stronger in the case of Caravaggio, because he is sort of, the world's most natural producer of spectacle. Okay, back to me, back to Schama, having pratted away during the day in front of the Caravaggio. And this is a spectacular Caravaggio. It's the biggest thing he ever did. It's the beheading of John the Baptist. It's in this cathedral in Valletta. It's nearly 20 feet long, wide, and about 8 feet high. So it's just huge. And all the figures are life-size, so this spooky sense of you being among the figures is even spookier than usual. And it's a very moving painting. Those of you who've seen the programme will know. The head, John the Baptist, is already dead, but his head isn't cut off. He's lying on the ground, bleeding, and his corpse is going the colour of a kind of young Stilton. And around him is a group of figures who represent art, who represent everything that's supposed to be brought to you by art, beauty and wisdom in particular, and heroic strength. But heroic strength is a male nude who's basically a kind of hitman, who's sort of naked, almost completely naked. He's got, with one hand, he's holding John the Baptist's head and his hair. And the other one, he's got this kind of terrifying knife, kind of mugger's knife, with which he's going to saw through the Baptist's neck. And then there's a kind of gorgeous girl. Beauty is this girl. It's not Salome, but it's sort of, some people think it's Salome. It's Salome's serving maid. And she's holding this exquisite gold or brass dish on which the head of the Baptist is going to be brought to Salome. And then there is a prison officer who's Wisdom, who's sort of very handsome, grey-bearded figure, and he's pointing at the dish. And so all the things that art's supposed to bring you, it's actually bringing you cruelty, atrocity, monstrosity, horror, and the action seems to go on forever. Anyway, so I've been prattling on about this painting, attempting to say something that I felt, because it's a desperate painting. It's a painting which makes you feel the power of cruelty, that just freeze frame, goes on forever. And I'd had enough, really. I mean, I thought, well, I've done what I can. Time to get out. Time to have a beer, particularly a beer at a pub round the corner, which is the place where a hero of mine, the actor Oliver Reed, died while making Gladiator. He fell off his bar stool. So I was really wanting to lift a pint of liquid homage to my naughty old hero. And bloody pub was shut, of course, it would be. How can a pub be shut in Valletta on a Friday night? It was, anyway. But before I found that out, I was sort of standing, wiping the makeup off and sort of recovering from an overdose of prating. And suddenly this little man nudges me in the ribs with something and says, please, take. And I think, what's he doing? Go away, I don't want to be poked, And he had a cassock on. He was part of he was a verger or a rector or a sexton, something like that. He was sort of Division 2 cathedral staff, Surrey. And his funny, kind of beaky nose and his glinting eyes. And I thought, okay, right, what is it? And he put this object that he'd been nudging me with in my hand. And it was something very heavy and very dirty and very old. And it was a key. It was this huge key. It was so big. It was about kind of 7-8 inches long. And it's a very, very old key. And I recognise these kinds of keys because in my one of my many early incarnations, I was a don at Cambridge College. And I was in charge, I don't know why they thought I'd be good at that, of the wine cellar. And it was a very old wine cellar. And you had one of these very, very old 18th century keys, I think, to open the door. And I went in there rather a lot. And so I knew about these old keys. And indeed, it was an old key. And it was kind of furry with age in a way in which very old, abraded iron becomes. And I thought, well, this is interesting. It must be something to do with the cathedral. And then he said, and then this little man who'd given me the key sort of smiled. I thought, why is he smiling? And he spun me around like a very small, kind of judo wrestler or something. He just physically turned me round. And I looked at the painting behind me. And there was that figure of the prison warder who was pointing to the dish in which the head, and he was wearing a belt, and on the belt were a group of keys. And one of them was the key I was holding. And he simply smiled. He said, yes, the key. And I realised I was at that moment holding a key, an object that Caravaggio had held 400 years before, pretty much exactly. 398 years before, when he was painting that painting, around 1608. And because the cathedral had lent him the key, Caravaggio always used live models. So he would have been lent the cathedral keys. He would have taken it to his model. He had to do this painting in situ. It's too big. He wouldn't have had a studio. He would have painted it in the oratory of the cathedral. And he would have held the key and he would have tied it on the belt to go around his model. So this extraordinary sense, actually, of the power of art, of actually being physically taken by surprise, mugged by art, was incredibly strong. It was a sort of an epiphany, that moment. And it's very scary because, as I say, if you're honest about doing art, what you want to do and what we're trying to do in this series is make you all excited about paintings you may know and may want to look at again, or sculptures you may know and may want to look again. Artists less familiar to you, I suspect not many of you will know about the French Revolution painter Jacques-Louis David. But we want to make these art as real to you as they were when the paint was still wet. or before the marble was polished. And every so often when you engage with these works of art, you have this moment of communion with the person who made it. And it has to be a communion made with a great deal of humility, but you must never make that humility boring somehow. The whole point of our series is not to be reverential, is not to embalm our artists, really, sort of cover them with a kind of silk veil of excellence, of genius, but to make them people who could make mistakes, people who could torment themselves with their own inadequacy of what they're doing. But you have to have this sense of spooky proximity to the artists and to the moment of creation, to the moment where it could all go wrong, all go pear-shaped, like that Cellini story I was telling you about. And if you have that moment of danger, you have art as suspense, and you feel transported, I think, by the power of art. And I want to say one more thing too, is that in each case of these works of art, we didn't necessarily choose them this way, but we certainly found that to be the case. Certainly in Van Gogh's Harvest with Crows, one of the last things, I think not the last thing, but one of the last things he does before he shoots himself. In the case of the Rembrandt, certainly in the case of the Picasso. Those artists were out to do something which made a big claim for art. They all were in the business of accepting that art was about the delivery of pleasure and about the delivery of beauty. I think even Picasso was exceptionally interested in beauty, and certainly in the work of the senses. And we show you one or two in our Picasso film, even though our main picture is not a film, and not a painting about beauty, it's a painting about atrocity and cruelty and war and bombing and suffering. But at these moments when these artists are working at fever pitch, at a level of white-hot intensity, they're out to change the world. They're out to change the way we see the world. They're out to change the way we feel about what it is to live inside a human skin. They want us to feel when we're in the presence of what they've done, the way we feel when we're in love, or when our parent or a loved one has died, or when we're frightened as shit about something, or when we're intensely concerned for our children. They want art to deliver that degree of profound, gripping, emotional force and strength. That's what they want it to do. And sometimes, as a result of understanding in a different way how we see the world, how we experience what it's like to be human, we can affect the larger world too. But none of these paintings, even Guernica, is a kind of party political broadcast. It's not that. It is just something that adds to a sense of what it means to be alive. That's what we tried to do in The Power of Art.